Today we're going to be discussing the FinClear Trade Center API and how clients can easily integrate with it. FinClear provide some APIs in an open API format. FinClear will provide a specification file which will allow clients to interact with the API. The main purpose of this API file is to allow clients to generate code to easily integrate and call the FinClear APIs. The Open API specification file can be used with third-party tools such as Swagger to generate code to allow easy integration. Let's have a look at how you would generate some code using our API specification. Here we have an example of using code to reference the specification file online to generate some Java application code to interact with the API. This particular tool has now generated some Java classes that we can use to integrate with the API. It's generated two forms of Java code. It's generated some model classes which represent all the data types used to interact with the API, including request and response types. It's also generated API classes which represent all the requests and responses that can be invoked on the API. Once we have the generated code, we're ready to begin talking to the API. Each API request requires authentication. The FinClear Trade Center APIs make use of the OAuth 2 authorization framework. Within the OAuth 2 authorization framework, we make use of the resource owner password credentials flow, where we give you a username and password to interact with the API. The username and password is exchanged for a token, an access token, that is applied to each request. We will run through a short example of obtaining an OAuth 2 access token. To acquire an access token from the API, a HTTP post to the /token endpoint is required, passing as parameters the grant type equals password, username, password, client ID, and client secret. These will be parameters provided to you when onboarding on the API. An example of running this in the code looks like the following. Here we can see we're doing a HTTP post to the OAuth server login.finclear.tradecenter.io/token. It's a post and it contains the grant type equals password. It contains the username, the password, client ID, and client secret. This HTTP post will respond with a JSON payload, including an access token, a refresh token, and an expires in field. The access token is what you'll need to apply to each request to authorize, and the expires in flag tells you the number of seconds for which that access token is valid. Once that particular access token has expired, you'll be required to perform a refresh token to get a new access token to continue using the API. The access tokens are very short-lived items and typically only last between 2 minutes and 1 hour. At the end of that period, you'll use a refresh token to acquire a new access token. This process is outlined in the OAuth specification under refreshing an access token. It is similar. It is a HTTP post, again to the /token endpoint, with the grant type of refresh token. We'll now run through a short example of using your refresh token to get a new access token. In this example here, we're again calling the /token endpoint. The payload this time includes the refresh token, which was acquired originally. Again, including the client ID and client secret. The response to this is a new access token, a new refresh token, and expires in indicating the duration of the validity for the access token. Now that we've generated code to interact with the API and we've understood how to acquire access tokens to authorize with the API, we can combine those two together to begin making calls to the API. Initially interacting with the APIs, we provide a front end which documents the available API endpoints, and you can interactively log in using the same processes. Here we can use the interactive login. Once logged in, we can go through and try out API endpoints. By executing them in the web UI. Here we can see the API responded with a successful response, code 200, with the following JSON payload. This was an example of invoking the API using the web front end. To do the same thing in code, this would be the following. So here we will begin a very simple Java sample. We're going to use the Swagger generated code that we have previously generated. And we're going to use our knowledge of how to acquire an OAuth2 access token to apply to each request. So the first bit of code that we need to use is the API client. This is one of the items that is generated by the Swagger code generation. We just create a new one of those, and then we want to set the URL where it's going to be invoking these. And just for the purposes of this demonstration, we're going to turn on the debugging, which will allow us to see the request and responses going back and forward. Now the process of acquiring the access token and refreshing it will be abstracted away for this example. So we have a Java class called a token manager, which takes care of that for us. We will provide the token manager with the location of the token endpoint. We will provide it with the client ID and the client secret. These will be provided to you when enrolling in the API. We will then supply the username and the password. By installing the token manager on the API client, this will allow the token manager to apply the access token to each request. For each of the categories in the API, the code will generate a new class. So for accounts, we'll have an accounts API. For back office, we'll have back office API, etc. So we'll use the Swagger generated code, the accounts API. Which it takes the API client as a parameter. So we're almost ready to begin our very first call to the API. Our very first API query will be to do an account search based on some string criteria. And we can go ahead and run that. Let's have a look at what it's done. So the very first thing we see it do is do a post to get a new access token. It's going to do a resource owner credentials flow using our client ID, client secret, username and password. This will provide us with the first access token required to make the request. We can see here we've acquired the access token. And then we've performed a HTTP GET to the account search endpoint, and we have used the access token in the header. And we've received a JSON payload with the account in the response. We can further extend this example by, once we've acquired an account, we can then use the back office endpoint to look at back office information about that account. The back office API class is one also generated by the Swagger code generation. The parameters for getting the contract notes for an account take three identifiers: a back office, an organisation and an account number. These three parameters are available in the account search response. The account identifier provides these three components. And we can go ahead and run that. So in this example here, we've used the API client and the token manager to acquire access tokens. We've invoked the account search endpoint. We've taken one of the results from the account search endpoint, used the account identifier to then go ahead and look at the back office and query contract notes. And we can see here the JSON payload for the contract note response. This should give you the building blocks to call any API endpoint on the FinClear Trade Center APIs. As a quick overview of the available API endpoints, we have here in the web UI, we have categories for accounts, account opening, back office, company data, contract notes, corporate actions, identity and access management, market data, news, orders, trading, and transfers. If you expand each of these components, it will reveal the endpoints that you can call to retrieve data from the API. These things involve finding and searching for accounts, opening new accounts in the FinClear system, back office data for including account holdings, contract notes, orders, transactions, positions, and ledger balances. The company endpoint provides company data and market prices. Contract notes provide C-note data for back office accounts. The corporate actions endpoint provides APIs to get upcoming and in progress corporate actions. Identity and access management allows the creation and updating of users, groups and roles within the system. Market data allows acquiring for price information, instrument data and searching. News provides news items available for ASX Com News and Dow Jones News. Orders endpoint allows seeing open trading orders within the system. Trading APIs allow creating new, amending and cancelling orders within the system. And transfers allows the transfers of CHESS holdings. From the web UI, you can access some code samples under the following link. These provide Java API examples, similar to the ones we've just created. They cover each of the components: accounts, back office, contract notes, etc. The HTTP REST API provides for the pool of information from our APIs. We do also support the streaming of data over a WebSocket for the streaming of price information, contract notes, news and orders. These are a JSON payload over WebSocket. with the JSON payload being the same as that provided by the REST API. We can go and have a look at the sample of the price streaming. Here we can see individual JSON payloads as text WebSocket frames. We can do the similar for contract notes, news, and orders in the system. So this has given you an overview of the FinClear Trade Center API, both the REST API and the WebSocket streaming. And it's given you the building blocks to take our specification, generate some code, acquire access tokens, and invoke the API. Thank you.